Before seeing the crowd-pleasing return of Charlie Cox as Matt Murdock in Spider-Man No Way Home, and before the critically and commercially successful Daredevil TV series, there was a man in a red leather motorcycle suit who portrayed Marvel's popular comic book vigilante. A man who would show that being blind could also mean being gifted. A man who also played Batman and Superman. A man without fear. With the controversial decision to add Netflix's popular dark and gritty series Daredevil to the more family-friendly platform Disney+, what better time is there to kick back, relax, and put on a throwback from the pre-MCU time capsule?
It's always good.
This movie is divisive and, in some cases, polarizing among fans of the Daredevil comics and TV show. But being the first live-action outing of the beloved Man Without Fear must mean that this film at least partially set the stage for the newer versions of Daredevil that we would come to love. But the big question, does it hold up? Find out in today's episode of Marvel Revisited. Daredevil made his first appearance in Marvel Comics' Daredevil comic strip written by Stan Lee and Bill Everett in the year 1964. The original comic run would introduce readers to Matt Murdock, a Catholic lawyer who was blinded in a childhood accident and devoted his life to vigilante crime fighting after the murder of his father, a struggling professional boxer who was trying to get back on the straight and narrow when he was murdered by a mysterious crime boss. This story would serve as the ideal starting point for New Regency decades later when a treatment for the script was being developed. In 1997, the film began production at 20th Century Fox in association with Columbia Pictures. However, New Regency Films acquired the rights in the year 2000, and any progress made on the Daredevil movie would be handed over to its new owners. Now, originally, 20th Century Fox was eager to get this project going, and their plan was to introduce a feature film to be directed by acclaimed director Chris Columbus, who you might know from films like Home Alone, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, and Mrs. Doubtfire. This, of course, would have been a film that looked vastly different from the movie that we ended up getting.
It's a myth.
In the year 2000, New Regency acquired the film rights and hired Mark Steven Johnson to write the script. Interestingly, Mark Steven Johnson was also hired previously to work on the Daredevil script at 20th Century Fox. This guy was just destined to be attached to Daredevil, and it was an easy hire for the studio given his experience with previous treatments of the character. This proved to be a smart move by the studio, and the script was turned in 2001 and received praise from the likes of Kevin Feige as, quote, one of the best scripts Marvel has ever received. The script was a hit with the studio, and the producers trusted Mark Steven Johnson so much that they even decided to hire him to direct this highly coveted Marvel masterpiece. And with the wheels of development rapidly in motion, it was time for this filmmaker to assemble his cast. Thank you for visiting JoBlo. If you like the show, please make sure you like, also subscribe, and hit notifications so you don't miss anything. Let's get back to the show. New Regency began casting in 2001, and their first big assignment for the casting department was to find a Hollywood star for the titular role of Daredevil. The studio originally considered Vin Diesel for the role, and you can imagine what that might have looked like.
It's never goodbye.
Actors like Guy Pearce, Matt Damon, and even Colin Farrell would be offered the role as well, but ultimately, they all turned down the offer. However, Colin Farrell would end up signing on to star in the movie as Bullseye, one of the movie's villains. Affleck eventually signed on and even stated that in preparation for this movie, Ben read every single Daredevil comic book to truly get an understanding of the character. Affleck really wanted to get this role, and apparently so did his buddy Kevin Smith, who modeled his iteration of Daredevil after Ben Affleck in the comic book series Guardian Devil. The role of Elektra required an actress with physical capabilities that could intimidate her scene partners as well as being beautiful and mysterious. Jennifer Garner was chosen for this role after competing with the likes of Salma Hayek, Penelope Cruz, Kate Winslet, and Natalie Portman. The late Michael Clark Duncan was cast as Kingpin, as the character's appearance called for a huge physical presence with a deep and menacing voice. Michael Clark Duncan had previously provided the voice of Kingpin on Spider-Man the New Animated Series, and even put on an extra 40 pounds for this role. Colin Farrell prepared for his role as the villainous Bullseye by reading Frank Miller's run of Daredevil and trying to nail the faces and mannerisms of Bullseye in the comics, as he knew he would not be wearing the iconic Bullseye costume. The movie opens up with a wide shot that slowly pushes into a battle-damaged Daredevil hanging on the roof of a church as helicopters shine their lights in pursuit of him. Daredevil is bleeding and out of breath, and right away this movie promises a dark and intense story where our hero doesn't always win. This may be my personal favorite shot in the movie. It looks so comic accurate and it just really sets the tone for this film. So Daredevil retreats into the church where a priest rushes to his aid. The priest knows Daredevil's true identity as he refers to him as Matthew a few times before unmasking Daredevil to reveal a blind man. The camera transitions through Ben Affleck's eyes and into a flashback sequence to start our story. Something I noticed when rewatching this movie is that Mark Steven Johnson is really fond of the zoom in eye transitions. There's like 6 or 7 of them in here, but none of them are as effective as this first one. So in the flashback, we get to see the origin of Matt Murdock as Daredevil. We see a young Matt whose eyes had not been damaged yet, and he's being bullied by some neighborhood kids. The movie quickly establishes the setting and the characters. Matt's a lonely kid with no friends, and despite his young age, he has to take care of his father, Jack the Devil Murdock, a retired prize fighter who'd previously been a rising star as a professional boxer. When Matt discovers that his father's actually an enforcer for a local crime boss, he runs away from his father and is basically in the wrong place at the wrong time, which causes a chemical spill and damages Matt's eyes, leaving him blinded. Oh look, another eye transition. So Matt wakes up to what sounds like an explosion, but is later revealed to just be dripping IV fluid. This is meant to quickly establish that Matt's sense of hearing has drastically enhanced. Then we get a montage with a very early 2000s rock soundtrack where Ben Affleck provides some voiceover exposition, explaining his enhanced 4 senses and newfound fearlessness that kind of complement the visuals of young Matt basically doing parkour around Hell's Kitchen. On the rewatch, I actually found most of the voiceover exposition to be unnecessary, and I don't think the seriousness of Ben Affleck's tone worked against the kind of silly and fun visuals that we were seeing. So young Matt is enjoying his new life and adapting exceedingly well to the loss of his vision. But things quickly change when Matt's father is murdered after his comeback fight. Matt uses his superhuman hearing to find his father dead in an alley with nothing but a thorned red rose left behind. Okay, so the flashback scene is over and we see that Matt is now a public defender working to defend the underdogs of society, something that he had promised his father he'd always do. Matt's in court and we see that the defendant, Joe Quesada, played by Paul Ben Victor, is getting acquitted on violent charges, much to the dismay of Matt and his comedic law partner, Foggy Nelson, played by a pre-Marvel hotshot filmmaker, Jon Favreau. And oh, would you look at that, it's time for another eye transition. The audience is now treated to a Daredevil suit-up scene, sort of in the vein of the Joel Schumacher Batman movies, but we get some shots of the suit and close-ups of the weapons before seeing Daredevil head out to fight some crime. He tracks down Joe Quesada in a dark and rundown biker bar, and we basically get to see Daredevil clobber an entire bar full of criminals in some very imaginative ways. See, Daredevil's mission is to get justice for the wrongdoers who skirt the law. He definitely doesn't seem to have a no-kill rule, as he's clearly okay with the outcome of the fight being the violent death of Joe Quesada, who breaks his back and gets hit by the train. It's here where we meet New York beat reporter Ben Urich, played expertly by Joe Pantoliano, who is hot on the trail of this mythical and mysterious night fighter, Daredevil.
Got it.
So this first big Daredevil action sequence in the bar was pretty neat on the rewatch, but I think it's clear that the dark and dank tone of the film clashes with some of the more campy and cartoony elements of the action. It does cause a little bit of a tonal disturbance, but it does transition back into a darker tone when we get this montage of Matt recovering from the fight. Matt returns home and we see the years of vigilante crime fighting and how they've weighed on him. He's scarred, losing teeth, losing relationships, and of course, losing sleep. So the next day, Matt and his pal Foggy are having coffee before work, and this is one of the more light scenes in the movie where the banter between Ben Affleck and Jon Favreau is kind of the main focal point, and it's really great. And I think you can see when actors have some sort of chemistry off the set, and these two definitely had chemistry, even when the cameras weren't rolling, which made it a very believable partnership. But the witty back and forth is interrupted when Matt catches the scent of what he believes to be a beautiful woman who's about to walk through the door. This is obviously meant to show off the freakish powers of Matt's remaining 4 senses, and this is where we meet Elektra. So Matt decides to make his move and try to strike up conversation with Elektra, and it doesn't go very well.
What are you...
Blind? Yeah.
I am so sorry.
Matt follows Elektra out of the coffee shop and soon engages in one of the most iconic yet highly memed scenes in the movie, the playground fight. This scene can be a lot of fun if you're in kind of a silly mood and want to see two superpowered people duke it out with a blend of chasing, dancing, and karate. I'm not sure if tonally this works for the movie, as it seems to snap in and out of being a serious, dark film and then a light, almost campy superhero movie. But this scene does set the stage for a blooming romance between Matt and Elektra that comes more into play later in the movie. So we transition from seeing this walk in the park with Matt and Elektra, and it takes us straight to a high-rise building in downtown New York. This is where we get our first full shot of Wilson Fisk, aka the Kingpin, the main antagonist of the movie, played by the late Michael Clark Duncan. Kingpin is a massive asset to Marvel Comics timeline, and especially for the likes of people like Daredevil and Spider-Man, and this was our first live-action look at the infamous crime lord, and fans were not disappointed. The role called for a physically intimidating body type with a menacing and intense voice. We were given that and then some with Michael Clark Duncan's performance. He really steals the show, and it's such a demanding presence in this movie. Kingpin is getting word of Daredevil's activity in Hell's Kitchen and sees this as a threat to his operation, thus setting the main conflict into action. It's here where we learn that Elektra's father, Victor, was working for Kingpin until he decided to get out of the life and try to get on the straight path. But now we check back in with Matt and Elektra for some more on-screen romance, and the believability of these two strangers as a new couple is lacking a little bit, as they do sort of rush the relationship along for the sake of the pacing of the movie. Meanwhile, Kingpin has hired a hitman to take out Victor, an Irish hustler by the name of Bullseye. Bullseye makes his entrance in this movie by throwing darts in a perfect bullseye series, only to then kill the owner of the pub with a series of paper clips. It's really something. So Bullseye is heading to New York to make good on his contract with Fisk, and quickly claims another victim while he's on the plane in order for the movie to establish this character as a ruthless serial killer with no code or conscience. So, unbeknownst to Matt, Bullseye is on his way to the city to stir up some trouble, while Daredevil is out on patrol, and we get this really cool shot of Daredevil's shadow growing on the wall in front of a street thug. This shot is actually really powerful, and the way it looks on film is just so epic. It definitely could have been a secondary poster for this movie, and I think it would have definitely got the attention of Daredevil fans. The moody and somber tone is immediately cut to a scene of Matt and Foggy discussing their financial troubles, as their firm is only taking clients that struggle to pay their legal fees. This also sets up the final battle later in the movie when Matt is invited to a ball with Elektra with a chance to network with New York's elites for his firm. Something that Foggy is all for, but Matt doesn't really seem interested in. Elektra shows up to visit Matt, and the two get this romantic scene together on the roof where Matt sees Elektra for the first time by using the sound of raindrops on her face to see her. This further solidifies Matt's romantic feelings for Elektra and makes for a much more gripping story when it all goes wrong. So now at the banquet, Matt and Foggy are introduced to Ben Affleck, who takes an interest in Matt as he secretly suspects that Matt might know something about the anonymous vigilante sweeping Hell's Kitchen's criminal underground. Wilson Fisk is also attending the party and even tries to hire Matt and Foggy as potential lawyers, only to be bluntly rejected by Matt.
I'm sorry, Mr. Fisk, my partner's a little overzealous. We can't represent you.
Why is that?
Because we only handle clients who are innocent.
Matt and Elektra share a dance and another romantic moment before it is interrupted by the early departure of Elektra's father, who is now on the run after discovering Kingpin's intent to have him murdered. And then Bullseye arrives. Like this. It isn't long before Matt suits up as Daredevil and takes it to the streets with Bullseye. The CGI on display for this scene wasn't terrible for 2003, but unfortunately the technology just doesn't hold up in 2022 and renders part of the scene as good as ancient. It just looks a little bit rubbery and digital, which was even a note made by some audiences when the film was released. Bullseye misses a shot that he takes against Daredevil, and this leaves Bullseye confused and upset, causing him to use one of Daredevil's batons to throw right through the heart of Victor Nachios, Elektra's father. This leaves Elektra assuming that Daredevil is to blame for the murder, as the weapon belongs to him. Unfortunately, forensics collect Daredevil's baton, and Ben Affleck recognizes it as the same one used by Matt. This scene is cool because it shows that there is a third party that isn't even on Matt's radar who is investigating him. We also get a cameo from pop culture icon Kevin Smith. Smith was actually credited as Lab Tech, but was referred to in the film as Kirby, which is a nod to Marvel's own Jack Kirby. What follows is a sequence basically following each character as they individually prepare for the last showdown. We see Bullseye and Kingpin talk about their mutual desire to eliminate Daredevil, and we get this clever line from Colin Farrell where he says,
I want a bloody costume.
Now for perhaps the most talked about scene in this movie, Elektra's training session. This scene is set to Evanescence's Bring Me to Life and showcases Jennifer Garner's dagger and martial arts skills. This scene is definitely of its time and goes back to the tone shifting thing I mentioned before. The scene takes itself very seriously and it's meant to establish a heavy rage and vendetta and call to action for Elektra, but the movie has already shown us teeter-totter dancing and human surfing as acceptable battle tactics. Daredevil goes out looking for Bullseye and is immediately tracked by Elektra, who intends to kill Daredevil as vengeance for her father. The two do battle while Daredevil attempts to explain that Bullseye is the man responsible for her father's death, but Elektra is too blind with rage to trust him. Eventually, Elektra stabs Daredevil through the shoulder and unmasks him to find out that under the mask of this fearless vigilante was her blind boyfriend, Matt Murdock. This realization gives Elektra the perspective that she needs to go after Bullseye, who has just arrived to finish his job. With Matt injured, Elektra faces off against Bullseye, who eventually impales Elektra with her own dagger. In typical action hero fashion, Daredevil's adrenaline from witnessing Elektra's death is just enough to launch him to his feet and take Bullseye down once and for all. The two battle it out in a church, and we're treated to an extensive duel between these two characters. It's a long scene, a lot of action. Something I really liked when revisiting this movie was that the cops and helicopters that were swarming the church were there for both Bullseye and Daredevil. It adds a layer of realism and excitement to the situation. There's real stakes for Matt Murdock as well as Daredevil if this goes wrong, and I love that idea. Eventually, Daredevil defeats Bullseye by tracking a sniper bullet to blast through Bullseye's hands before tossing him out of a window, nearly killing him. Matt heads to face off with Fisk after learning from Bullseye that Kingpin was behind his father's murder. Kingpin is ready for the brawl and the two have a brutal fist fight. I love this particular fight scene. It feels intense, personal, and even exhausting. Daredevil is getting beaten pretty bad by Kingpin until he sets off the fire sprinklers in the building and uses the vibrations from the water to see Kingpin and subdue him. Just before killing Fisk, Matt stops himself and decides to let Kingpin live. He does this to prove that he was ready to be a hero for the people of Hell's Kitchen. Not a lethal guardian, but a figure of intimidation to criminals. Matt triumphantly leaves the building with no mask and leaves Fisk with broken legs and totally immobile, defenseless against arrest. The movie ends with Matt accepting the loss of Elektra and moving forward with restored faith. It does squeeze in one final scene where Ben Urich is writing an article exposing Matt Murdock as the vigilante of Hell's Kitchen, only to then delete the entire article and evidence. He briefly sees Daredevil and gives him the nod of secrecy before Daredevil leaps off of the building and flourishes his batons one last time. There's also a fun post-credit scene with Bullseye where you see him in a full body cast in the hospital being annoyed by a fly, and he kills the fly by flinging a syringe right through the middle of it and nailing it to the wall. Bullseye. The film was released on Valentine's Day 2003 across more than 3,000 screens in the country. It shot to the #1 of its opening weekend, earning a box office open of $45 million in the first 2 days, which at the time was the biggest February box office pull since Hannibal in the year 2001. However, week over week, the box office numbers would continue to decline. The movie ended with a global box office total of $179 million off of a $78 million budget.
Swish.
This means that the movie was considered a success, but the reviews were mixed, with some critics like Roger Ebert rating it a 4.5 out of 5 stars, while other critics say it fails to bring anything new to the genre. Fans seem to like the movie at the time, and it's safe to say that this movie's existence is what gave us the Daredevil series, which everyone seems to love. However, despite the film being immediately picked up for a sequel and spin-off, Ben Affleck declined to return, stating that wearing a costume was a source of humiliation for him and not something that he wanted to return to anytime soon.
I'm in honor of that promise.
The spin-off plan for Elektra would take priority over the direct Daredevil sequel, and Jennifer Garner would return to be reborn in this critically panned film. But of course, that is a story for another time. Thank you for watching. We've got plenty of movies to be explored and plenty of scenes and costumes and characters to be admired next time on Marvel Revisited. We'll see you soon.